The Graphic Histories Podcast.
I got bit by a radioactive bug. I tried an experimental drug. Went up for a stroll on a gamma testing range. I found an enchanted hurricane. I made a serum that made me small. I modified the serum so it would make me tall. Radioactive isotope in my eyes. Dying alien helped me accessorize. I gained the proportion and strength of a spider. Now I'm invincible and I can fly. I lost my sight, my other senses were heightened. I'm gonna put on my pajamas and go fight crime.
Hey there and welcome to the Graphic Histories Podcast. My name is André. I'm your host, and big thanks to Ukla Mock for our theme song, Superpowers. And big thanks to you, gentle listener, for tuning in once again to another fun-filled, action-packed, thrill-ride, nail-biting, edge-of-your-seat episode. Today's guest is Ron Randall, who has a very interesting conversation. We have a great talk about his career, how he got there. Some surprising stuff comes up, especially a great conversation about his connections to Alan Moore and some other people in the business as he progressed and came along and finally landed on Trekker, which is a very cool little indie comic that he is deeply involved in and because he created it. And, we have a great discussion about all of that sort of stuff and a lot of insight. It's a great episode, great talk, and I hope you enjoy it. I do have to give a little bit of thanks, and by that I mean a lot of thanks, to my partner from my other podcast, the X-Rated X-Men Anime Review Show, Davin Skellhorn, for giving me a hand lately getting some of my guests. I do feel like I need to give him a producer credit at some point. Hopefully if I get busy enough that I can just allow him to compile all this stuff and do it for me, that would make things a lot easier. Then I could do more interviews and go off from there. But Davin has helped me out a lot, getting me some great interviews. Ron was not one of them, actually. It was all me. But there are quite a few very cool people coming down the pipeline, and that's all thanks to Davin. And one very cool person that I got coming down as well, which I will discuss when it gets closer to it. Somebody that's kind of important to me, and if you're an indie comics lover, I think it's someone that will be important to you as well. So in the real world life, things are shooken up a little bit. I've kind of left my regular office job to focus on my own business. I'm doing this because it's gotten to the point that, I'm making more money than doing it in an office job. And, I have a lot more freedom, obviously. I don't got to go into the 9 to 5, which should open up my schedule to do more fun stuff and focus on, parts of my work that I really enjoy. Which is pretty cool. I'm very excited about it. I've done this before, but never to the level that I'm doing it now. So, you get to a point in life where you kind of think, well, if I'm not going to do this sort of stuff, it's never going to happen, so I got to get out there and do it. And now that I have, I'm out there and flying free, which hopefully will give me more time to do some more writing, some more drawing, and maybe finally get back to comics, which is something I always talk about in the show, but I've yet to get to do. So I have a few things in the fire, a few irons, a few ideas. A novel idea that I'd like to start working on. So who knows? Maybe some cool, fun stuff will come down the pipeline. But bigger, brighter things ahead, which is very exciting for me. So in the other world of things, make sure you tune into our sister podcast, the X-Rated X-Men Anime Review Show, as I mentioned before. That's the show I do with Davin, in which we go back and rewatch the X-Men show from the 90s and talk about it. We have reached the end of the original show after a few years. So now we're moving on to the X-Men films. The next episode coming up, actually I don't know, because I record these in advance of when the episodes drop, so I'm not quite sure where we'll be by the time this episode comes. But at the time of recording, we just watched the Generation X television movie that was supposed to maybe be a pilot or maybe be the start of more television movies. However, it's the first, live-action X-Men thing that was ever filmed, and for that it deserves to be watched. We're going to watch all the X-Men movies in order as they were released. So upon watching that, it's a doozy of an episode of the show, because there's a lot of interesting, ridiculous, kind of fun, but mostly abhorrent and very much a product of its time stuff. But, for what it is, it's not that bad. People shit on it a lot, but honestly, all said and done, it could have been much, much worse. It was pretty bad, but it could have been much, much worse. Alrighty, well, with that said, why don't we get into the conversation in which I talk with our guest, Ron Randall.
earbuds in if the sound would be better.
No, the sound actually sounds really good.
Oh, all right.
Surprisingly good.
Well, I've got an old iPhone. It's an iPhone 8, so I use ancient technology, I guess here. But if it works, it works, right?
Yeah, absolutely. That's kind of, as I get on in age, I feel the same way. Sometimes it's like, why bother learning the new thing if you like the thing that you're doing already?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, that's for me. That can be a bit of a hazard in my career, that I can just keep doing my same old thing and over and over again, and then the industry sort of drifts farther down the stream and leaves me behind. So, so I sort of have to, I keep one eye on that. I don't obsessively try to keep up with all the new stuff, because I can't, but I try to keep enough of a hand in what's going on currently, that my work and my process and the technology that I use doesn't fall so far out of step that I'm just, like isolated on a desert island someplace.
Do you find that, as far as technology goes, with like what's available now for art and how quickly people can produce it, that there's a real like that the industry itself, wherever your contacts are, whatever you're working on, or sort of want you to do that? Like, do they push you to go into newer stuff just to make it faster, or is it or are they generally respective of your process?
Well, I don't. These days, I'm really mostly just working on Trevor. But when the last jobs that I did for comics people, I hadn't got a sense of that being feeling any pressure to change my process that way. I had been changing my process anyway, just because if you're in this industry, unless you're one of the very few who can actually approach this like it's fine art, for most of us, it's a commercial job gig. That's the category that comic book art is in, which means finding an efficient way to get the work done with good quality is always at a premium. So any new tool you can use, resource or reference that you can draw on to make you more productive while not losing quality or cutting any crucial corners, we all tend to just clutch onto those things like life preservers. So but when I was doing work for I did some commercial gigs that were like storyboarding for things and stuff like that, and those jobs, while they never made it a requirement to use digital production stuff, it was just sort of necessary anyway, even if it wasn't stated, because the speed at which you have to turn some of those jobs around and make corrections on the jobs. If you're working analog on a solid piece of paper and with pencils and brushes and stuff, making corrections to the degree that these people expect them these days, that's almost impossible to do. So that's kind of a long-winded answer, but that's the way I've seen it go.
No, that's very interesting, because I'm curious about that. I've noticed just amongst, like, I just recently, a few months ago, got an iPad Pro and got the drawing tablet software, and then you got one too, do you? Yeah, and got I've noticed another guy I had in the show before from Toronto, Adam Gorham. He was drawing at a convention using it, and I remember watching him and thinking about how easy he made it look. So I decided to get one and give it a go myself. And I was always kind of a purist in that it had to be the old style way. But man, oh man, after I started playing around with it, and you realize how fast it can be to like fix inks, to fix pencil, like you pencil it, ink it, color it, do it all on one thing, and all in real time, like without having to scan and go through that, and then tablets and making them combine with your computer. It's just so much simpler.
It is, yeah. Absolutely. There are still things that I prefer when I do get to do analog work. There are things about that I like, the tactile feel of it. There's a physicality to it. It requires a level of focus and discipline that I find it a lot harder to achieve when I'm working digitally, because it is so much easier to make a correction. If I got a brush in my hand and it's loaded with permanent black magic or India ink, and I'm putting that down on a piece of paper, if I make a mistake there, correcting that is a huge process, really. Whereas if I just make a stroke with the stylus on a Cintiq screen, just click the undo button or something. So So there's something that's much more like a Zen-like focus you have to have, especially I feel when I'm inking,
Yeah,
when I'm working on paper.
that used to drive
And
me
there's
nuts. So like
and
I would
there's a
always
certain,
ruin stuff inking, always.
well, yeah, it is that old formula to do one drawing while all you have to do is do about 10,000 bad ones first.
Yeah,
It's true with
yeah,
me too.
that's true.
Yeah, but I do like the physical. I do like physical medium,
Hmm.
but again, it's just, especially once I made the shift to spending my time doing Trekker and using Kickstarter campaigns and self-publishing them, I'm having to wear so many hats and do so many jobs that in order to produce the work at the rate that I need um, to serve the book well, to be able to afford to keep doing it, et cetera, et cetera. I made the switch to working on Trekker digitally too,
Hmm.
which I only did once. Once one of my studio mates was using, at the time it was Manga Studio before it
Hmm.
became Clip Paint Art, whatever they call it now. But
Procreate's the one I use, but there's a few out there that people talk about that are different. So
yeah,
yeah.
but when the technology got good enough that I could generate lines on a screen
Hmm.
that felt similar to the quality and texture of lines I would make and the range of lines I could make
Hmm.
with a brush or a pen on paper, then I said, "Gee, this might be something worth exploring." So I did that, and it's really made a huge difference. Is my ability to produce work that I feel is of the quality that I want it to be for my book, and at the speed that I need it to be for my book.
Yeah.
So yeah,
A friend of mine
I'm
went
grateful.
even, yeah,
Pardon me?
a friend of mine went even farther, and there's some kind of a cover you can put. It's like a film you can put over your iPad to make it feel like paper when you're like,
Yes, I haven't done it yet, but I've seen people doing that,
yeah,
and I'm
I've
very intrigued.
considered it. Me too. I like to check out his when I get a chance because
Yeah, yeah.
it does look pretty cool. I do miss that tactile feeling as well. I tried using the style the flange pen like to ink and all that, and I would always ruin stuff. And you're right, the process to go through it was monstrous.
Yeah,
But
yeah.
something you mentioned does bring up a good point to me is the like how a lot of the creators. I spoke with Steve Rude recently on the show as well, and he's a lot of his work is going all forward now with Kickstarters for his Nexus stuff, and like he has his wife and I think his daughter and some other people that help him out, but like it's such a different category now for artists. Like the days of just being an artist are kind of gone. Like now you can't just show up. Like there are people that do it, but for the majority of people, you need to be your own social media manager. You need to deal with all the print houses, getting the stuff done, Kickstarters, promotion. It just seems like the day of the quiet artists working and toiling in their studio and that's all they get to do are kind of gone. And it's cool that the power's in your hands because then you have the characters are yours, the rights are yours, it's all yours. So if anything ever comes of it, you stand to reap all those benefits instead of whatever pittance Marvel throws their old artists
Right.
for the new movies or writers. But to me, it's like it's such a like it was a full-time job before to meet deadlines, but now it's like twice that much and then some
Yes,
problem.
exactly.
Unless you're so
Yeah.
wildly successful, you can hire a team to do it for you. But those are few and far between as well.
Few and far between. A quick question: should I rotate my camera? So I
No,
see
it's
that you're
okay.
sort of in the.
I only use the audio for this, so you're all good.
Oh, okay, okay.
Yep. I just like to have the video because it's nicer for a conversation.
Sure, absolutely. Yeah.
Yeah. So how do you feel that way? Like, do you feel like it takes like it pulls you in too many different directions, or do you feel like it's something that you're okay, or is it just the price you have to pay to be able to get your work out there?
Well, initially I approached it the last way I said it's the price that you have. If I want, I realized that because I was doing Trekker up until about 2000, and I'd done Trekker back in the day, back in the ancient history times that your show apparently talks about. We can get into that. But then I took 12 years off of doing Trekker because of the sort of book that it was. It didn't find a large enough sort of mass audience or whatever that Dark Horse and I could afford to have me do it steadily and regularly.
Mhm.
So I was just doing it in sort of a hodgepodge scattershot. She'd have a standalone story, then backups in a few issues of the Dark Horse anthologies, Dark Horse Presents book. one-shot specials. So it's a very sort of hide and seek way to try to get a series out, and it wasn't working well. So I put the whole series on hiatus for about 12 years. Then I got back to it and did a few more stories with Dark Horse. But what I could see happening was Trek was a small fish in Dark Horse's pond.
Mm-hmm.
So they would we would produce a book, and then they would wait and see once it broke into the black and made its money back, then they'd find another spot in their schedule for me to do another Trekker trade paperback, And I could see, well, this is going to be years-long gaps between books again, which is exactly the reason I put the project on hiatus in the first place. So I finally said, well, if I'm going to do this and have the books come out in a format and on a frequency that I think serves the series well, and will let me get the stories done before I die, because I knew how much story I wanted yet to tell. I was gonna have to try to go to crowdfunding to try Kickstarter. So I went to Kickstarter sort of as an act of desperation. And to answer your question, yeah, at first that, well, because I picked the brains. See, the only thing I had going for me was I knew absolutely nothing about how to do Kickstarter, right? So I was picking the brains of some of my contemporaries and some of my colleagues that had done Kickstarters, and especially valuable was to talk to ones who had a sort of a similar career profile to myself. So figuring that what worked for them might work for me, et cetera, et cetera. So anyway, and I just came quickly to realize exactly what you're saying. You've basically got to figure out how to be a publisher.
Yeah.
And how to either speak the language of printers so that when you stipulate the specs you want for your book, that you're speaking the right technological terms, right? Or find somebody who you can pay to be your printer consultant, which is basically what I wound up doing. But yeah, and then you're on social media quite often because no one's going to promote the book if you don't. I don't have an advertising department, and I'm the marketing department. So I pay a couple of people to help me out. I have a colorist that assists me with the coloring, and I hired somebody to be my editor to read the scripts through and look over the art. And it's a very bright young woman named Alyssa Sala, who is my editor. And that's, to me, having an editor is like having a coach, like if you're on a gymnastics team. And you're up there on the uneven parallel bars and you're flipping your body around and stuff. And you can't always be paying attention to where your arms are on the bar and whether your feet are, and your legs are spread apart. That's what the coach is supposed to do. They're seeing it from a different perspective and can spot some things that might just be invisible to your own process. So I hire people like that and somebody to be my print consultant to make sure that the files that we send to the printer, are going to get printed like I want them to. I just don't know that world well enough. But still, even hiring out a little bit, I'm still wearing lots of hats, and then running the campaigns. And when somebody leaves a comment or asks a question about the campaign, that's me. I'm the one who's there to answer these questions. So it's a lot of hats to wear. And at first I said, well, this is just the price that I'm going to have to pay to get my book out there like I want it to. But what I found out, much to my surprise, I have to say, was that I really enjoy those interactions. And I really enjoy what I thought was going to be the hardest challenge of the job, which was being on social media, posting. Back then I was using Twitter, and I'm still using Facebook, and I use Blue Sky. I'll be using that on this campaign. And I was told before I ran my first campaign, I paid a professional marketing consultant that specialized in crowdfunding things. What can I do to make my campaign a success? Because the first time out, I had no idea. It was going to find 12 people that remembered Trekker fondly, and I'd get $500, and I needed thousands and thousands of dollars.
Yeah.
So I thought this could easily be just a huge disaster. So anyway, this consultant said, well, you need to be on Twitter X number of times a day, Facebook X number of times a day, every day for 30 straight days. And I just made this noise like, she said, I know it can be way out of the comfort zone. It is for most artists, but she said, if you want this thing to go, this is the best advice I can give you. And I thought, well, that's just going to be excruciatingly painful. Nobody likes to say, oh, I'm doing this thing. I think it's so fun. Won't you please give me some money? It's terrible. But what I found was that because I'm so passionate about Trekker and I want so much to keep doing it, that trying to find new ways. Since I have the books already done before I launch a campaign, I've got all the images from the entire
Oh, well, you're well ahead of most people that do them.
Yeah, well, yeah, there's a reason I was really lucky. I mean, I know most people don't have that opportunity, but so I could just say, well, what panel can I pull from now and make some little terrible pun or some clever thing that will act as a teaser and maybe make somebody want to click on the link and check out the campaign. And I found that by turning it into that sort of a mental puzzle for myself, to avoid being repetitive and tedious and just keep saying the same thing and using the same image over and over and over again. I wanted to have variety, so that if some poor schlub was following me on Facebook or whatever, just saw 20 posts from me over the course of a few weeks, I wanted there to be at least enough variety that maybe it's a little bit entertaining,
Yeah, 100%.
So I have found it to be fun and rewarding to do that. All of that said, it is still incredibly time and energy, demanding.
Oh yeah, 100%. Yeah, I would say. Cool. Well, so where's home for you? Is it Oregon? Is that right?
Yeah, I was born and raised in Portland. Back in the late 70s through the mid 80s, I lived in New Jersey. I went to the Joe Kubert School. And got to work with Joe directly, and some of my classmates were, guys who became sort of household names in comics. That was great.
They like
Steve Assett, John Totleben, Tom Mandrake, Tom Yates, Jen Dursema, Kim DeMolder, Tim Truman, people like that. Those were my classmates, my peers, and guys that I looked up to too.
Wow. What led you to that school? Like, what? I guess, how did you get there? Like, how did you find out about the Kubert School? Were you just always like a nerdy art kid that just wanted to get into comics, or?
I was living in Portland, Oregon, and this is, I grew up, it was in the 1960s, way before, the internet or Federal Express or, even, oh shit, anyway, any of those sort of, the technology wasn't there to make you be able to sort of work remotely, I guess the best way to put it. And back then, if you wanted to be in the comic book industry, you were basically living in the middle of Manhattan and working for DC or Marvel, because that was the game, maybe Archie, if you consider that, but I was always into the, the mainstream stuff. And the idea about me, a little kid from Portland, Oregon, moving 3,000 miles away to the East Coast, it was just unthinkable. It was like saying I wanted to be an astronaut or, an NBA player. It was like, it was a dream, but I saw no path to make it happen. That didn't stop me from making, from the time I was in like grade school, 5th, 6th grade, I started like designing my own comic book characters and telling my own stories. I had a buddy or two that were into comics and stuff. So we'd get together after school and sometimes do a little bit of homework, but then make up our superheroes and tell our goofy stories to each other. And that bug just bit in me. Most of my buddies who going grade school, middle school, into high school, some would have some interest in drawing in a comics, but they would drift away and get into other pursuits. Like a normal, well-developed human would get interested in sports and cars or whatever. Yeah. And for me, that bug just never left me. So there I was, wound up going to Lewis and Clark College, which is a really nice liberal arts college in Portland, double majoring in art and English. And besides doing my classes, I was still drawing for myself comic book stories. And I just couldn't let go of the bug, even though, again, no idea how I could make a dime doing it. And after 2 years, I was at the college. I said, "This is awesome. I just love this collegiate lifestyle." I was taking classes with the poet laureate of Oregon and great art teachers and stuff. But they were, especially the art teachers, they were more into conceptual art, so they would deign for the under the lower class persons as freshmen and sophomores to do basic drawing classes and some painting technique classes, but they wanted it to be like melting pieces of plastic and putting some feathers on it and putting it in the wall, and that was art. No, but that wasn't what I was into. I was very much into comic book and classical illustration and representational art. So I thought, I'm going to graduate from the school in 2 years and I'm going to starve to death. I have no employable skills. But right around that time, I was reading like the Comic Spire Guide, which is like a newspaper for people swapping comics and buying and selling and stuff, and articles about the business. of the industry. But there was an ad for the Joe Kubert School in that thing. And I mean, Joe was a legendary artist back then, and a personal hero of mine. I especially loved the Tarzan adaptations.
I was going to say, was
DC.
Tarzan what led you to him?
Yeah,
Because that was the big one, I think, at around that time, right? So
yeah. I mean, I was aware of his Sergeant Rock and anime stuff when I was younger. They kind of blew my mind, but I was more, still more into superheroes and stuff. But when I saw the Tarzan stuff come out, I just a few years earlier, I'd been reading those novels, and I said it was just so amazingly vivid, and it had the grit and texture of the Burroughs novels. And Joe was he's meant to do that kind of stuff. Because it turns out when he was a kid growing up in the 30s, I guess, he read the Hal Foster Tarzan strip in the Sunday papers. Yep. So that's what he fell in love with as a kid, and all that comes across in those DC comics that he did. Anyway, so he was starting the school.
I have one of his art, those artist editions they put out, like the oversized. Yeah, I have one of his Tarzan ones, and it's
I have both. I have both of them.
It's so cool. Like they're beautiful, man. And I love what you talked about earlier about, like, when you make errors and having to fix them and correct them, how painstaking that could be. And it's interesting looking at the notes, in the margins or where they fix those errors, so you can see all of that on it, which is super, super cool.
Absolutely. So, yeah.
Well, you mentioned Hal Foster too, which is he has a special place in my heart, and a lot of people. I'm in Nova Scotia, Canada, and he's from here. So right. Prince Valiant is one of our holds that we claim because Foster is from here. So that's very cool. Absolutely. Anyway, so it led you to Kubert.
Sorry.
Oh, you got led to the Kubert School through the Comic Buyer's Guide.
Yes, exactly. Yeah. I sent in I just put together a bunch of, some samples of my work from my class at college and some of the pages of the really, really terrible comic books that I was trying to do. Sent them off to the Kubert School, and I wound up having a long distance phone interview with Joe. Wow. Which was just
that must have been surreal. Here's a phone call from Joe Kubert.
From Joe Kubert. Yeah, I'm talking to Joe Kubert about why I'd like to go to his school. I mean, and I was just a dumbass college. I had no idea. I don't have no idea what I said, but fortunately I got into the school when it was still very new. I was in like the second year. So I think they were just trying to find warm bodies. Yeah. But anyway,
someone's got to pay that tuition. Someone's got to pay that tuition.
Exactly. Yeah. Anyway, the next thing I know, I'm standing in the middle of New Jersey, and I said, I must be serious about this, because here I am standing in the middle of New Jersey. So I went to the school, spent a few years staying back east, trying to insinuate myself into the industry. The plan for me was always to move back here to Oregon. It's always going to be my home. I knew that, but the hope was that I could get in solid enough with DC and Marvel that I could then move here and work from 3,000 miles away. A couple of people were starting to do that. I think Roy Thomas had moved out to California by then. Anyway, so that's kind of what happened. To very long story short, that's basically what happened. I eventually moved back home. I was working long distance, but I just happened to move back here basically the year the Dark Horse Comics was starting up, and I wound up getting invited to be a guest at a local comic show. The same summer that I got home, I'm tabling at that show, selling pages of the stuff I was working on for DC at the time. And Mike Richardson and Randy Stradley, the publisher and then editor of Dark Horse, which is like 4 people at the time, came up to the table. They were looking to get established artists, to come and work for their little startup company, and made me an offer I couldn't refuse. They said, if you come and work for us, we'll pay you your rate, and you can do whatever you want. And I knew I'd never hear that sentence again in my life. So that's how I came to depart from DC and devoted myself to launching Trekker. So that's how that got started.
So what was the path to DC like? Was that just like I've noticed you did obviously worked on some pretty, I mean, maybe not as important at the time, but certainly important, in retrospect with some comics. So like what led you to that position? Was it just bringing your portfolio in and they liked what they saw and that was it? Or was there like a longer path to get to DC?
I guess, Dave, a little bit. I mean, that's basically it. But it was a more tortuous route. It wasn't quite as straightforward and linear as that. Yeah. I was doing a few, because Joe was the editor of his own Sergeant Rock book at the time.
Right.
Some of the graduates, he would sort of handpick some of us who seemed like we were the most focused and intentional about trying to have careers as specifically as comic book artists. There were other people at the school who were there just for commercial art reasons or whatever like that. But for those of us who really seemed like we were into the comics, Joe would assign us some of these little short stories in the back of the Sergeant Rock book, sometimes 2-page stories, 3, 4, 5-page stories. And that was a way for us to continue to work one-on-one with Joe, where he would give us a 5-page script from somebody like Robert Kanigher, who'd been writing comics for decades. And we would take those home with us and work on our thumbnail layouts and take them back to Joe at his house. And then he'd go over them and we'd go home and do the pencils. So it was really like a master-apprentice relationship, one-on-one with Joe Tudor.
That's amazing.
And gradually, after time of working on some of those backup stories, he knocked enough of the sludge off of me, or polished us up enough that then we started getting work on some other things at DC. Maybe there was a backup in one of the mystery books, or maybe eventually like a fill-in issue of that. And so that's how several of us managed to just get our foot in the door and then gradually let it expand over the course of 2 or 3 years roughly. We were just getting started right around the time of the DC implosion, which was in about 1982, if memory serves. And when that happened, everything just kind of shut down. DC was producing a lot of books. They pulled their line back, and they kept working with the people that were their pros, their established veterans, but they didn't have much room for little startup kiddies like me. So some of us there we just stuck it out. We just kept working on our samples and taking them, getting in to see people whenever we could, and gradually things opened up again, and we eased our way back into the business that way.
Well, because it wasn't until I guess a little further along when DC sort of shifted their focus to more adult, seemingly centric comics, with that it seemed that they pull a little bit out of that. One, of course, being the Swamp Thing, which I noticed you worked on, and I'd be remiss not to ask you about that. As any comic person worth his salt is a fan of Alan Moore. So what was that situation like, and what was he like to collaborate with?
Well, you were said a little while ago that I'd worked on some projects, most of which weren't maybe the importance of them weren't really noticed at the time.
But it's funny, in my experience, most of the things I love. Oh, you like that?
We knew at the time. We knew what Alan Moore was doing.
Yeah,
we knew he was like reinventing what it meant to be a comic book writer.
Really, even at the time. Wow.
Yes,
that's amazing.
So most would get together and we'd say what Neil Adams did for comic art in the 1970s. Alan Moore did for comic book writing in the 1980s, which was essentially he just frickin' raised the bar for the level of sophistication, maturity, subtlety, nuance. Neil Adams brought all that stuff to comics. It wasn't that there hadn't been people doing that. People like Hal Foster were doing it in the 30s and 40s. Lou Fine, Will Eisner, but the mainstream comic book artists before Adams came along, they were working at a certain level and with a certain sensibility, curvy or whatever, right?
Yeah.
Adams brought this level of sophisticated commercial art, to comic books. It just really hadn't been there in any significant way. And then it became like the standard baseline sort of.
Yeah.
And what Alan did with Swamp Thing was he very quickly he just raised that bar for writers. So and that was really he came on and my buddy Tom Yates was doing Swamp Thing with a different writer, and then Alan Moore came on, and then I don't know the reasons that the switch happened, and they brought in Steve Bissett and John Toddlin to be the artists working with Alan. But Karen Berger was the editor of all that stuff. This is before this eventually grew to become Vertigo Comics, but back then it was still just DC. And since I had been a classmate of of Steve and John, and since I was getting a little bit of work with Karen Berger on some of the mystery books, I was doing some of those frontispieces for like House of Mystery and House of Secrets, where I'd be drawing Cain or Abel, and I was really just trying to do sort of Bernie Wrightsy sort of work, because how can you not? It's what
of course, yeah. It's hard. But there would be
times. Yeah, but there would be times when Steve would be, when when Steve would be laboring so hard over getting his Swamp Thing pages to be just so, that they'd run into some deadline problems. So they'd need a few pages penciled on an issue, or sometimes they need me to ink a few of Steve's pages so John could get caught up on other stuff. So I became sort of like this utility player. Sometimes I'd fill in and do 5 pages of an issue that Steve was penciling, and sometimes I'd ink a few pages that John was inking over Steve's pencils and stuff. So I and later I did. There was one where they needed to do a complete sort of fill-in issue thing. So they took your first Swamp Thing, story, which was like I forget how many pages that was, but I did the framing sequence, which was called Abandoned Houses, and where I got to Darkane and Abel, and I did that all. I mean, I worked directly from Alan's script on the whole story for that one, and it was amazing. I mean, Alan he's so brilliant, and he was such a generous collaborator, is the way I'd put it. He did something that you're absolutely not supposed to do as a writer, and that is he would write these huge blocks of panel description. And then the way the script is in a full script comic book, it's kind of like a movie script. There's a panel description where you describe all the elements that are necessary to have inside that panel, and sometimes maybe suggesting whether it should be a close-up shot or a medium shot or whatever like that. And then beneath that, you write whatever the copy, the narrations and the dialogue that the character is going to speak in that panel. And you do that for every page of the comic. And usually for a good writer, you want to keep those panel descriptions kind of short, because the more you put in there, the more tedious it gets, and it can be labored. And a lot of artists just don't want to sit there and read a lot of complicated stage direction from the writer. It's our job to visualize the story. You just give me the little list of things that need to be there, and I'll orchestrate it all. I'm the visual storyteller here. You're the writer guy, right? It's a collaborative thing. But Alan, because he has always had such a strong visual sense and storyteller sense, he would have all these great ideas for the mood he wanted a certain panel to have, right? And he would always make these suggestions that were spellbinding, because he was, even when he was just writing a caption description that was only to be read by me and the editor, he just couldn't stop writing really great stuff. So it was entertaining, and it was very conversational, and it felt like a guy was just sitting there spinning a yarn in front of you, like over a beer, and he's telling a story that's absolutely captivating. And all you can think of is, these are great ideas. I just want to take the story and make it as good as I possibly can.
That's a good creator.
And he very rarely made it feel like he was dictating, this is what needs to be in this panel, Ron. What he'd say is, okay, there might be some candles with flickering candlelight, and maybe there's some skulls on a shelf with the shadows playing eerily across them or something. But then he'd always say, that scene in Psycho where the character is walking up the stairwell and you see the shadow moving across, and the violins are going pizzicato, blink, blink, blink. That's the feeling that we're after. Anything you can do that could sort of get us that kind of a feeling will make this panel work. So do whatever you want to. So it was like, he sort of gave you plenty of room for input. It's just that most of his ideas and suggestions were so good that I couldn't think of anything better to do with them. So
that's super cool. I actually recently got, and I really I'm gonna have some more time coming up, but I got his masterclass or whatever, the one where he talks about writing, and I only watched the intro and maybe one of them, and it just listening to him speak opens up this whole world in your brain of thinking about story and thinking about how to approach it and being more empathetic towards your characters and also other people in your life, and using that for your writing. It's just so interesting, and I feel like I'm going to rewatch it several times after I finish, because it's such a deep well of information when it comes to that sort of storytelling and writing. But it's super cool to hear that. I mean, obviously I'm a big fan of his work, and I love that even amongst the creators at the time, they knew that the game had been elevated, because it certainly feels that way. I reread it, the whole Swamp Thing run, not too long ago, maybe a year ago. Yeah. And I remember just everything impressed me more than the previous thing. It was so good.
Yep.
Wow, that must have been a joy to work on.
It was a real thrill. Like I said, my contribution to the overall, Swamp Thing body of work that Alan and Steve and John did was I was very much just a supporting role. I can't take any credit for what that series means, other than to say that I helped get a couple of the issues out on time, and tried not to drop the ball too far. I really felt my role then, and I've done this at a few other times in my career, when there's a series that's, it's a pretty successful series that's going along, and it gets into deadline trouble, and they need somebody to come in and sort of be the fireman, can get the emergency under control.
Mm-hmm.
And I always feel my role in those times is to try to make the transition sort of as seamless as possible. So that if reading a Swamp Thing comic book and there's Stephen John, I don't want here's where Ron took over for a couple pages and tried to assert his own style and vision on this series. I was trying to, I didn't achieve it, but I was trying to get as close to what Steve and or John were doing to keep the work feeling like it was whole. So it wouldn't pull the reader out of the story or be distracting.
That's the way to be. Like, it's funny how comics remind me, like, just when you're speaking about the detail that Alan Moore would put into his page descriptions, like, it's kind of the mark of either, like, well, it can be a couple things. It could be a really, someone, a pretentious writer, or someone that actually really, like, cares, or just flows out of them naturally. Like, I was just in a play that I directed. I was in by Kurt Vonnegut, and his stage direction in the writing, there's all this stuff in it that's like genius, but nobody will see it in the audience. It's just for the actors, and often it's not even really that relevant to, like, whatever you perform it, but just the language and the way he writes it is so brilliant, that, like, you almost wish that the audience, I mean, that script is available, like, they did sell it, or they did print it as one of his books, so you can read it and get all that yourself, I suppose. But when you're watching the performance, it's like so much detail and rich texture of stuff in there that you don't see. One thing I wanted to ask about,
in a way that's I feel that's true a lot of times, with anybody working in probably in any field of art, and meaning, like, I know that I have a Patreon where I share with the backers of that. Every page of Trekker that I do, I put up the thumbnails, the pencils, the inks, and the colors.
Cool. That's awesome.
And I talk a little bit about something behind why I made the page and why I did this and that on the page. And I find myself quite often using the phrase, "This is something that the reader will not notice on any sort of conscious level as they're reading the story, but the idea is for it to sort of subconsciously, it contributes to the atmosphere or the flavor, or it helps them to make a connection without them having to be consciously aware of it. Because I want the reader to be immersed in the story, right? And they just I want them to follow that through, like, what's happening next, and should I be frightened for my character? Are they winning the battle, or will they get there in time? That sort of thing. But then there's all these other things going in around the edges that make the reader feel like I'm in a real world, or it's a vivid textual universe that I'm feeling immersed into here, without being aware of what I'm doing to make them feel that way. So a lot of times with Kurt Vonnegut's writing a play, a lot of what he's doing is that isn't something that you and the audience are supposed to notice consciously.
Yes.
It just should work on that deeper level, the unconscious, the subconscious one, that somehow conveys a convincing reality or a convincing vision or a sensibility that only Kurt Vonnegut has, And when you read an Alan Moore script, at least when I read it, I mean, I said, it's like he's pulling you inside the way he sees this world, the world of Swamp Thing or whatever. And so he's bringing you as close to his point of view as he can, so that when you're drawing it, you're really on the same page. That's kind of the way I felt about it.
Yeah. Well, even just like your comment about not wanting to be a standout, wanting to fit into what they've built. Like, even that's a theater thing. Like, obviously, when you're working collaboratively with a whole group of people, if one person is chewing the scenery and hamming it up, it just takes away from the whole production. So you really want to find a way to fit within the framework. And that's what just sort of made me think of that as well, which is very cool. Yeah. One thing you did work on quite a bit, which is something that was important to me as a kid, because I read most of the books, was the Dragonlance comics.
Oh yeah,
and that must have, like, what was that experience like? Because I had a huge, like, I obviously as a young kid I got really into Lord of the Rings and stuff, and then once you're done the Hobbit and Lord of the Rings, what else do you have? So it's like I can't remember what led me to Dragonlance, but then of course there was like 100 of those books. So once you read the first few and then start reading all the rest, and then I found out there's a comic, and I whatever. But I grew up in a very rural small town, so the only comics I got where you could get on a spinner rack at a hobby store, or you'd find it at a used bookstore. And I think I found some of the Dragonlance books there, which was like the gold to me, because the idea, like, this is kind of before you could even go on the internet and find out get the more
Sure.
of them or any of that sort of stuff. So, but yeah, no, it's super cool. And I saw you worked on Dungeons and Dragons comic as well, which I'm sure is connected, but it's just neat to do a fantasy book of something of that stature at that time period. Like, I don't know how big it was in the print world at large. I just know, to me, it was a big thing.
Right.
So yeah, was that was this fantasy something that you enjoyed drawing or taking your art to that style?
Oh yeah, yeah. When I was a kid growing up, I first came across the the comic books of the day, Superman, and then a little bit later Spider-Man, the Fantastic Four, and all those Legion of superheroes.
Mm-hmm.
But then as I got a little bit older and got more into the drawing stuff myself, I found Flash Gordon crossed my radar, and that led me to the classic illustrators, Raymond and later Al Williamson and the EC artists. But somewhere in there, I also came across a guy we've already talked about a little bit, Hal Foster,
Mm-hmm.
and Prince Valiant, and that bug really bit into me. So later, skip forward a handful of years, and I'm there at Joe Kubert School. And as we've already discussed, Joe Kubert was also a huge Hal Foster fan,
Mm-hmm.
really into fantasy and, well, mostly adventure, action and adventure stories, nothing to do with superheroes, right?
Mm-hmm.
And that really became the thing because I also had developed a huge love of Al Williamson's work, his elegance and the romantic, stuff that he did on Flash Gordon, taking over carrying on the torch of Alex Raymond. So even when I was working in the mainstream of DC, which again back then was mostly superheroes, I wound up being attracted to and often getting to work on books that were in genres other than superheroes.
Mm-hmm.
And one of those was definitely when I got to work on the Dragonlance books. And when I was on Dragonlance, because I was also a fan of the Tolkien stuff, between being a fan of Tolkien stuff and the illustration styles of Wally Wood and Hal Foster,
Mm-hmm.
I just put as much of that into the Dragonlance work as I possibly could squeeze in there. It was a great chance to play with that kind of what I could just sort of classic comic illustration rendering techniques and stuff like that.
Yeah.
And I just really leaned into the guys whose work I loved so much, because I felt that kind of a style approach would not work on the Fantastic Four, but it worked great on something like Dragonlance. So I felt it was a great place for me to be. And it was really fun because I also got to work with the writer Dan Mishkin of that series, who was a great guy, lives in Michigan. And we started when I first knew I was going to get the assignment. My first thing was I read a few of those first trade paperbacks of the Dragonlance characters, right? And so I thought, okay, there's a bunch of characters here. There's like the 13 main characters in Dragonlance. So I drew a big fancy model sheet of each of these characters to get into the get into the mood. Then in talking with Dan, we realized that in those paperbacks, they pretty much told all those principal characters' stories pretty thoroughly. There wasn't a whole lot of room for forging new ground with these characters, right? Their stories are kind of told and pretty well told, pretty completely told. So I'm pretty sure it was Dan who came up with the idea, or working with the editor Barbara Kiesel at the time, to invent a new character, who Reva Stormcrown was our creation, our contribution to the Dragonlance world. So we would have her be our principal character, and then the established cast of Dragonlance could then sort of appear in sort of in backup roles and stuff. So that gave Dan and I a whole new landscape that we could explore within that Dragonlance world, and she would still be confronted with the same kind of dragons and the same villains and challenges, but we could tell new stories, we felt. And so I thought it was a great approach, and it obviously gave me a chance to design a character of my own, which is always a treat. And then have her, interacting with some of the established characters from the Dragonlance world. So it was kind of a best of both worlds in a way. We got to draw on all the richness that already existed in the series, and then try to, contribute our own accents around the edges, so to speak.
That's awesome. It's funny you mentioned Al Williamson, because I have one of his those EC hardcovers they're putting out recently that have like all of the work of like Al Williamson or Jack Davis or those guys in it, and I have a bunch of them, and I have the Al Williamson one, and it's funny just glancing at the work, the style of his art. I can see it in that Dragonlance book. That's really cool. I never made that connection before, but you saying that really brought it up. Yeah, I guess I'd be remiss not to bring up Trekker too, obviously, which is one of your big, as you mentioned, your big thing,
Yeah.
and certainly your passion project. So, what led you to creating that series, and what were the inspirations for that? I mean, I see you've worked on Star Wars and a few other things, but that came
Yeah.
later on after you'd done Trekker. So,
Yeah.
I'm assuming you had that obviously, like any nerdy art kid, was probably into that sort of stuff beforehand. But
Oh yeah.
yeah. So, and I guess it makes sense with Flash Gordon and all that sort of stuff as well, bringing it to the space.
Yeah, exactly. Well, I guess in a way, the origins of Trek go back to a few years beforehand when, like we were talking earlier, how I first broke into the business. I was doing little stories and stuff for DC, and then I got paired up with a great writer named Gary Cohn to do a backup story in the Warlord comic book, and it was called The Bear on Earth. And it was Gary's take. It was sort of like an Edgar Rice Burroughs sort of sci-fi future where the sun is turning into a red giant, so it's getting bigger, and the Earth is just baked, so it's like a desert planet, like Dune.
Mm-hmm.
And there's some evolved, lizard creatures and it's like fungus creatures that live underground, where there's underground ocean still remain. And some human beings have come back from the stars to Earth, which is this baked wasteland. Anyway, so that was this cool setup for a sci-fi series, and it was really fun to do. And it had a strong female lead character, which was really unusual at the time. She was the lead of an action adventure science fiction comic book. It was pretty, or not comic, but mini, backup story. And we got to do a mini series out of it too. It was a great experience. It was great working with Gary. I loved science fiction and all that stuff. So fast forward a few years when I moved back to Portland, and the guys met me at a convention here. The guys started Dark Horse, invited me to come and work for them. And I said, well, and they said, you could do whatever you want. We'll pay you your rate. And I thought, well, this is like my one shot that I'll ever get to design my own dream project without being concerned too much about whether or not I could sell it to a publisher or whether or not it's commercial. Just what would I most want to do in comics? That's the way I heard their invitation. Whether that's how they meant it or not, I don't know. But so I just started turning it over my head. And so I just said, what would the ingredients be for a series that I would just be confident I could really enjoy, and I would like to be like my signature work in comics. And so some of those ingredients came from Bear on Earth, a strong female lead character. I wanted it to be science fiction, but I wanted to be I wanted a different texture and feel to it than what than Edgar Rice Burroughs thing. I wanted a little bit more grounded in reality, or science fiction, version of reality, because I'd seen Aliens and Blade Runner, and I'd read the Dune trilogy and stuff like that. So, and the Foundation trilogy. So I just wanted to come up with a series that I thought I could put as much of these different angles and aspects of science fiction into as I could do. And I wound up coming up with what became Trekker, a story of a young woman who's really gifted as a bounty hunter, but is destined to be more than that. So I could start off by telling these sort of grittier, boots on the ground action adventure science fiction stories, and then gradually over time have the series evolve as her character grows. She finds out things about herself, who she is as a human being, what are the forces that are really shaping her world, and stepping into a larger role, like a character of destiny sort of thing. So I baked that all into my pitch to Dark Horse for Trekker. And they probably should have said, this is a very nice idea, Ron, but we don't know how to sell a comic book like this. But they didn't say that. They just said, that's cool, do it. So then I had to figure out how to do it. So I've been trying to figure out how to do it ever since.
No, that's awesome. Yeah, I was going to ask about the Blade Runner influences, because I could see a little bit of that in it. Just like anytime you see retrofuturism used to describe something, it's like Blade Runners. You can just feel the fingers of Blade Runner somewhere nearby, influencing it. So, that style of future, like I always liked that dirty lived in future style. That came with Alien, came with Star Trek, or Star Wars rather, came with with Blade Runner. And I love the new Blade Runner, the Denis Villeneuve one, like the 2049 one. I thought that was gorgeous. He's a Quebec filmmaker, so he's Canadian. So, but I've always loved his stuff. All of the movies he's made, I've been a huge fan of. So I was super excited. I don't think commercially did super well, but critically, I think it's genius. So it's really cool.
The trick with some of those things, was they felt the worlds felt lived in.
Yeah,
You know,
exactly. Because
the doorknobs are banged up. Sorry,
humans
go
aren't
ahead.
a clean species. Like
Yeah,
I love the idea of Star Trek in this sort of utopian future where everything is really clean and neat and organized and we all get along. But I really don't like there's this deep pessimistic bend to me, I guess, that can't accept that humans will get ourselves shit together that well, that like by this point in any point in the future we'll be such a well-oiled machine that all this will be sorted. Like the idea that it's all just sort of gross and dirty and like, I watched John Carpenter's first film, Dark Star. I don't know if you ever saw that, but it's a very lived-in, gross sort of future where,
right.
you know, space truckers essentially blow up planets that might be in the way of future developments for humanity. And it's very low budget and very, rudimentary, but there's some very cool stuff in it. Some great ideas that certainly leads towards knowing the filmmaker Carpenter became. But
Right.
that sort of lived-in, gross future, right?
Yeah, and that's a key. Like you, I love Star Trek, and I really love that aspirational view of mankind improving and stuff. But Star Trek at its best works where all of that sensibly doesn't get in the fact that you've got to have conflict if you're going to tell a good story. You've got to have conflict, and
that's why Deep Space Nine is my favorite Star Trek, because it's mostly they're at war almost the whole show.
That's one of the reasons Deep Space Nine is my favorite. And the other was the fact that was designed from the beginning to be a really long story. One long story.
Yeah,
I love the episodic nature. I love the episodic nature of the original series and like the new Strange New World series. Those are I really love them. But the layers of story that go into Deep Space Nine, and the interlocking of the characters and those interweaving plot lines and
the kind of stuff you didn't get in the other show, like really complex, deep moral meditations on things. Like I thought I love Avery Brooks, and I think Captain Sisko is my favorite Star Trek captain ever. But like because he like that just to draw a particular point, I guess the episode where he's telling the story about how basically Garrick faked an attack to get the Romulans on their side. And, at the end he deletes it, but it's his sort of admission to essentially committing a war crime in order to help save all these people and turn the war in their favor. And it's just such a brilliant episode where you're like, I love those sort of stories because nothing is black and white. It's not as simple as saying we're right, you're wrong. And I always found early Star Trek, which I love too, sort of like, I mean, I don't think it was intentional, but there's almost this like moral simplicity where it's like, hey, us humans, we're perfect. We got it all figured out. And then it's just them bombing into other societies and be like, you guys are all backwards. Here's how you do it right. And then, that's just how it goes down. But that one just seemed like getting into the weeds of what it really would probably look like if there were different species in different relations, especially at war. So all those sort of things just open up a whole world of and I know Roddenberry wasn't a fan of that. I think they didn't go into a war until after he died, but because I think he didn't want them to. I think he wanted to keep things like utopian and happy. But
I think so. As I understand it, as I remember hearing it anyway, especially when they got to do Next Generation, they wanted the characters of the crew to be much more sort of self-actualized and much more emotionally healthy. So they didn't have a lot of conflicts between the bridge crew or whatever, and I felt that was really lacking. Because what made the original series go was Kirk, Spock, and McCoy always like jibing with each other and getting on each other's backs and nagging each other and yelling or bickering, But there was that tension that trilogy had a real energy there that made it feel very human, you know.
I agree.
And it took Next Generation, for me, from my perspective, it took Next Generation of 2 or 3 seasons to really grow into that, where they would allow the characters to have these richer, more complicated and in a way compromised inner lives where they could have conflicts with one another and disagree, because the like I said, that's where the drama comes in. That's the engine that drives your story. That's the coal you throw into the engine to make the story go. Is you got to have conflict, you got to have frustrated hopes and dreams dashed and challenges and all that sort of stuff. If you don't have that, then it may make for a very nice peaceful life, but it makes for a pretty bland story.
I guess that's the point, right? happy lives aren't interesting watches. If you just watch a movie of a guy going to the store and buying gum and come back home
Yeah.
and being his wife loves him and everything's going great, you're not going to be too enthralled or
Yeah,
conflict.
yeah. Yeah, you want
Conflict
to live
brings
that life, but you don't want to watch that movie.
exactly. That's a very good way to put it. Actually, I like that. That's very good. Well, beautiful. So what do you have on the go now? Like, is it just all in the continuing the Trucker books for your Kickstarters, or?
That's pretty much it. I occasionally, I was just talking to another guy. I was at a convention last weekend and tabling next to another artist who was also saying, he occasionally will take on a little bit of other work, but he says I don't have enough time to take on another like big pro. I can do a cover here or a little short thing there, but for him and for me both, when you're doing your passion project and you're really trying to make it go by having it come out there on a regular basis, and you're using crowdfunding, as you and I were discussing earlier, that's wearing a lot of hats. So I like it, and it's handy to take on a short term job here and there with doing a cover illustration for this or a short commercial thing there. But by and large, I'm devoting 90% of my time to or more to working on Trekker, and it's and that's a deal I'd sign at any time. If I can devote all my time to seeing this series through to I've got a resolution point in mind for it. I want to bring this arc of this character. She's on a life journey, and it's not like a cartoon strip where the character starts, goes to an adventure, and gets back to the same place they're at, and then next issue the same thing happens over again. She is supposed to evolve and grow and change as the series goes on, and then it's more like a novel in that regard, a long form novel, where we reach a point of repose, and that's what I'm going for. And if I can get that done while I'm still on the right side of the dirt, I'll consider it sort of mission accomplished.
Oh, that's awesome. No, it's nice and refreshing to hear creators talk about their works with definitive end goals in mind. There's so many things that just seem to be designed to go on forever and ever and end without a resolution that'll be satisfying. I mean, mostly in television and stuff, but in comics too. I mean, sometimes people have these grand plans and then either the studio changes or they go a different way, or some movie comes out and they got to focus on something else. So it's nice to see that you have a definitive overarching story that's gonna come to a natural conclusion eventually. So
and awesome. And I have the luxury of I don't have a studio to answer to. I don't have a raft of 5 producers, and I don't have a property that has an entire industry built around it that has to go on in perpetuity. I can have
that's true.
This can be my vision, and I will say though that if I've got the endpoint in mind and know about when I'm going to get there, and we'll see if I'm still got all my faculties and telling stories that are at a quality that works for me, and if the reader support is still there, I do know what I can do to do more stories, because when you're a comic book artist, you don't ever just stop being a comic book artist. To me,
exactly.
You always want to tell more stories, but the main goal I have is the original vision I had for the series back then and back in the 80s when I first started it was to have this story with an arc, and again to get to that point. So that's the primary mission. That's the thing I'm totally focused on pretty much exclusively right now. But since I'm getting close to that point, I'm thinking, what's going to happen when I get there? I do know things that I can do afterwards that I would like to do, but like you just said, I mean, I want this series to reach that point where there will be a resolution that hopefully readers will find it a satisfactory one. It will feel artistically valid, or whatever you want to call it, so they won't leave that. I don't want them to leave. I don't want to leave anybody dangling, and I'll feel good if I can get to that point. So that's what I'm working on now. And I guess as this thing airs, I will probably be in the middle of the Kickstarter campaign for the latest Trekker story. So that's what I'll be doing.
And actually, it's just to wrap this up. You mentioned that like when you went into this, you're flying blind and you didn't know what to expect. And it might just be a few people that that remembered the comic fondly. Obviously, since this is continuing on, you found your audience, I suppose. And do you find like it's a majority of people that had discovered it back in the day, or is it a mixture of people that are discovering it through your campaigns and Kickstarter, or some combination of the two? Like where's the bulk of your fandom coming from?
It's definitely a combination of the two. I'm sure that when I launched that first campaign, the first people to gravitate toward it were people that had heard about it because I'd recently been doing some issues of Dark Horse. So I met them at a convention, or maybe they'd seen me talk about it a little bit on social media. But once you've got a presence there on Kickstarter and it's active and you've got traffic coming to your site, the Kickstarter does some to sort of help spread the word. And again, just me being pretty much incessantly on social media for 30 straight days talking about it, and asking people to help spread the word, because that's crucial. I can only reach the people on social media that I'm following or they're following me.
Yeah, exactly.
But all those people are connected with people that I'm not, and some of them might like my comics. So it's the campaigns have grown that way. The word spreads. My core is probably I can't even get the percentages right, but some of them are definitely people that have remembered Trekker fondly from back when it was a little floppy black and white comic book at Dark Horse. But I also know there are others who I met, like, last year at a comic convention, had never come across Trekker, bought a book the first day of the show, came back the next day and said, give me the rest of them, and are now back in the campaigns. And it's really gratifying to me when somebody who's in their 20s or 30s sees Trekker, think it looks cool. I give them my little, convention pitch about it. They buy the book and become a big fan. The fact that I'm doing something now that I started over 30 years ago, where the stories and the character have enough of a sense of whatever you want to call it, reality or relatability, that it can still work for an entire, sort of younger generation is incredibly gratifying.
That's very cool. And do you feel like, as a legacy, I guess, for your work in your career, this is like the best representation of it? I would assume so. I think you're so engaged with it and obviously love it so much.
Yeah.
Just to continue it on. Like if you were to be remembered for one thing, it's you want this book to be it.
Yeah. That's pretty much what I said back when I was first putting the final touches on getting the pitch ready to send it to Dark Horse. I said, if this is the one thing that I'm remembered for, I will take that deal.
Beautiful. Well, thank you so much for being on the show, Ron. I really appreciate it.
Oh, it was great. Thank you. It was a great conversation. I appreciate being on the show.
No, I absolutely enjoyed it, and I'm looking forward to checking out some more Trekker. So
great.
Awesome. Thank you very much.
Thanks
We'll talk to you soon. Bye-bye.
Yeah, bye.
There you have it, my conversation with Ron Randall. Great chat, great talk. I really do love having engaged conversations with people that are passionate about their work and all things nerdy. And Ron's certainly one of them. A guy with a lot of passion for his Young Creator Project and for his work in comics. And, kind of a bit of the old guard, the guys that got in there and learned from the guys that were just doing a job, as he mentioned in the talk. And that's very interesting. I feel like we need more stories from people of that generation before we aren't able to have them anymore. So very happy to Ron to give his story to us and come on over to the show. Very excited that you got a chance to hear that. I hope you enjoy it. Please let me know. Please rate, subscribe, all that good stuff. And make sure to do the same with our sister podcast, X-Rated, the X-Men Animated Review Show. On the next episode, in 2 weeks' time, we will have Joe Isma, who is the co-creator of Morning Glories, best-selling comic, and Eisner-nominated one as well. He did some work for the Vault Comics. He's also an artist for Riverdale, Jughead the Hunger, the Archie Comics. He does work for DC, Valiant, and Dynamite. So I'm very excited to chat with him. And as I mentioned earlier, Davin is someone I had to thank for getting some of these guests. He is one of Davin's grabs, so thank you, Davin, for that as well. I know he's a listener of the show, and I certainly appreciate his continued support and all the work he does on our other show as well. So thanks, Davin. In the meantime, stay safe, have fun, don't do anything I wouldn't do, which means you're wide open. And, just enjoy life. It's here, you're living it, and it's meant to be enjoyed. So do it. And while doing that, come back in 2 weeks' time to listen to another fun-filled episode. The Graphic Histories Podcast is a proud partner of the United Federation of Podcasts.